The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of St. Michael's Cathedral, as dozens of military vehicles began arriving for what would become one of the most talked-about funerals in the nation's recent history. General Harrison Blake, a decorated war hero who had served his country for over 4 decades, was being laid to rest with full military honors. His casket, draped in the national flag, had been lying in state for 3 days, drawing thousands of mourners from across the country. Among those gathering outside the cathedral was a lone figure in an immaculate dress uniform that seemed to shine brighter than all the others. Captain James Mitchell of the Royal Guard stood at attention near the cathedral steps, his chest adorned with ribbons that told the story of a distinguished career. At 28 years old, he had already earned more commendations than officers, twice his age, yet today he found himself in an impossible situation. The Royal Guard held a special place in the military hierarchy. Unlike regular army units, they served directly under the monarch's command and were considered the elite of the elite. Their duties ranged from protecting royal residences to participating in the most significant state ceremonies. Captain Mitchell had been personally selected by the Queen herself to represent the Royal Guard at General Blake's funeral, an honor that should have guaranteed him a place of respect at the ceremony. As the crowd of uniformed officers grew thicker, around the cathedral entrance, Captain Mitchell approached the heavy oak doors where a stern-faced colonel was checking the guest list. The colonel, a heavy-set man in his 50s with graying temples, barely looked up as Mitchell presented his credentials. Captain James Mitchell, Royal Guard, reporting for General Blake's funeral service, Mitchell announced with the crisp precision that had been drilled into him since his academy days. The colonel's eyes swept over the ornate uniform before settling on Mitchell's face with barely concealed disdain. "I don't see your name on the approved list, Captain," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Mitchell felt a flicker of confusion but maintained his composure. "Sir, I believe there may be some mistake. I received direct orders from Palace Command to attend this ceremony as the official representative of the Royal Guard." The colonel's expression hardened as he flipped through several pages of the guest registry with deliberate slowness. Other officers were beginning to take notice of the exchange, their conversations dying down as they sensed tension in the air. The morning breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers from the elaborate wreaths that had been placed around the cathedral entrance, a stark contrast to the growing unease of the moment. "No mistake, Captain," the colonel replied coldly. "Your name is not on this list, which means you're not authorized to enter. I suggest you return to your quarters and verify your orders through proper channels." The words hit Mitchell like a physical blow. He had served with distinction in 3 different combat zones, had been decorated for valor under fire, and had never once had his authority questioned in such a manner. The Royal Guard's invitation to military ceremonies was traditionally considered automatic, a recognition of their unique status within the armed forces. "Colonel, with all due respect," Mitchell began, his voice remaining steady despite the humiliation he felt building inside him. "The Royal Guard has never required separate authorization for state funerals. Our presence at such ceremonies is mandated by protocol that dates back over 2 centuries. The colonel stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that only Mitchell could hear. "Times change, Captain, and right now, this ceremony is under Army jurisdiction. If you're not on my list, you don't get in. It's that simple." Around them, other officers continued filing into the cathedral, many of them shooting curious glances at the Royal Guard captain who stood frozen at the entrance. Some recognized him from previous ceremonies and state functions, making the situation even more awkward. The golden braids on Mitchell's uniform, which typically commanded immediate respect, now seemed to mark him as an outsider among his own military family. Mitchell's mind raced as he tried to understand what was happening. General Blake had been a close friend of the Royal Guard, having served alongside several of their commanders during the border campaign 15 years earlier. The general had specifically mentioned in his final wishes that he hoped the Royal Guard would be present at his funeral, considering their shared history and mutual respect. The cathedral bells began to toll, signaling that the ceremony would begin in 30 minutes. Mitchell watched as the last few stragglers hurried past him into the building, leaving him standing alone on the steps with the colonel, who seemed to take perverse pleasure in the captain's predicament. "Sir, I request permission to contact Palace Command to verify my authorization," Mitchell said, pulling out his secure communication device. The colonel shrugged with feigned indifference. "You're welcome to try, Captain, but I doubt you'll reach anyone in time. And even if you do, my orders come from the highest levels of Army Command. Unless Field Marshal Williams himself walks over here and tells me otherwise, you're not getting through these doors." The mention of Field Marshal Williams sent a chill through Mitchell. Williams was the supreme commander of all land forces and one of the most respected military leaders in the nation. If the orders to exclude the Royal Guard had come from his level, it suggested something far more serious than a simple administrative oversight. As Mitchell stood there, watching the cathedral fill with uniformed figures while he remained locked out, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just a guest list error. The tension between different branches of the military had been growing in recent months, with some Army commanders expressing resentment about the Royal Guard's privileged status and direct access to the monarchy. The colonel finally turned away, apparently considering the matter closed, but Mitchell remained at his post on the cathedral steps. His orders had been clear, and as a Royal Guard officer he had been trained never to abandon his duty, regardless of the obstacles placed in his path. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, and the sound of organ music began to drift from inside the cathedral, but Captain James Mitchell of the Royal Guard stood firm, waiting for whatever would come next. Inside the cathedral, the ceremony was beginning with all the pageantry befitting a military legend. The massive pipe organ filled the sacred space with somber melodies, while hundreds of uniformed officers stood at attention in perfectly aligned rows. General Blake's casket rested on a raised platform at the altar, surrounded by floral arrangements sent from military units across the globe and foreign dignitaries who had served alongside him. Meanwhile, Captain Mitchell remained outside, his situation growing more uncomfortable by the minute. Several junior officers who recognized him had approached quietly, expressing their confusion and concern about seeing a Royal Guard captain barred from such an important ceremony. Word was spreading through the military community, and Mitchell could feel the weight of their stares and whispered conversations. Sergeant Williams, a veteran supply officer who had worked with the Royal Guard on several occasions, approached, Mitchell with obvious concern etched on his weathered face. "Captain, sir, what's going on here? I've never seen anything like this before." Mitchell maintained his professional demeanor despite the growing embarrassment of his situation. "There appears to be some confusion about the guest authorization, Sergeant. I'm working to resolve it." The sergeant shook his head in disbelief. "Sir, this doesn't make sense. The Royal Guard has been at every major military funeral I can remember. My father served under General Blake, and he always spoke about how much respect the general had for your unit." These words struck Mitchell deeply because they were true. General Blake had been one of the few Army commanders who genuinely appreciated the Royal Guard's unique role, and had never shown the resentment that seemed to be growing among other senior officers. The general had often spoken publicly about how all branches of the military needed to work together, regardless of their different traditions and reporting structures. As the ceremony continued inside, Mitchell found himself reflecting on the recent changes in military politics. Over the past year, there had been increasing criticism of the Royal Guard's special status. Some Army leaders argued that having an elite unit that reported directly to the monarchy created unnecessary divisions within the armed forces. They claimed it was an outdated tradition that had no place in a modern military structure. The debate had intensified after a controversial incident 6 months earlier when the Royal Guard had been deployed on a sensitive mission without consulting Army Command. The mission had been successful, but it had created significant tension between the palace and military headquarters. Some officers felt that the Royal Guard operated with too much independence and needed to be brought under regular military oversight. Colonel Henderson, the officer who had denied Mitchell entry, represented this faction within the Army leadership. He had been vocal about his belief that the Royal Guard's privileges should be curtailed and that they should be integrated into the regular command structure like any other unit. Henderson saw today's funeral as an opportunity to make a statement about the changing dynamics within the military hierarchy. As the morning progressed, more officers began gathering outside the cathedral, either arriving late or stepping out for brief moments of fresh air. Many of them recognized Mitchell and were shocked to see him standing alone on the steps rather than participating in the ceremony. The sight of a Royal Guard captain being excluded from such an important event was unprecedented and began to generate serious discussion among the assembled military personnel. Major Thompson, a logistics coordinator who had worked closely with the Royal Guard during the recent peacekeeping mission, approached Mitchell with barely contained outrage. "Captain, this is absolutely unacceptable. General Blake specifically requested Royal Guard participation in his funeral arrangements. I was present when he made those wishes known to his staff." This information was crucial because it meant that Mitchell's exclusion wasn't just a bureaucratic oversight but a deliberate decision to override the deceased general's explicit wishes. The implications of such an action were staggering, as military tradition held that a fallen officer's final requests regarding their funeral should be honored whenever possible. Mitchell carefully considered his next move. He could attempt to force the issue by demanding to speak with higher authority, but that might create an even bigger scene and could potentially escalate into a public confrontation that would reflect poorly on both the Royal Guard and the military as a whole. Alternatively, he could quietly withdraw and file a formal complaint through official channels, but that would mean abandoning his duty to represent his unit at this important ceremony. The captain's training had prepared him for combat situations and diplomatic challenges, but nothing had prepared him for being treated as an unwelcome outsider by his own military family. The Royal Guard prided itself on maintaining the highest standards of honor and dignity, even in the face of adversity, and Mitchell was determined not to let his personal humiliation compromise those values. As he stood there, maintaining his military bearing despite the awkward situation, Mitchell noticed a black sedan with official plates pulling up to the cathedral's side entrance. Several high-ranking officers emerged from the vehicle, their uniforms indicating they held positions at the highest levels of military command. Among them was a figure that made Mitchell's heart skip a beat. Field Marshal Williams himself had arrived at the funeral, his presence indicated by the 4 stars on his shoulders and the immediate attention he commanded from every officer in sight. Williams was a legend in military circles, having served with distinction in multiple conflicts and earning a reputation for fairness, integrity, and unwavering dedication to military traditions. The Field Marshal's unexpected appearance changed the entire dynamic of the situation. If Mitchell could somehow bring his predicament to Williams's attention, there might be a chance to resolve this matter at the highest level. However, approaching the Field Marshal directly would be a significant breach of protocol, especially for an officer who was currently being denied entry to the very ceremony Williams had come to attend. Mitchell watched as the Field Marshal made his way toward the main entrance, pausing briefly to acknowledge the salutes of various officers. The moment was approaching when the highest-ranking military leader in the country would pass directly in front of the Royal Guard captain, who had been denied entry to honor a fallen general. The tension in the air was palpable as other officers sensed that something significant was about to happen. The morning sun had climbed high enough to cast sharp shadows across the cathedral steps, and the sound of the ongoing ceremony drifted through the heavy doors, creating a surreal backdrop for what was rapidly becoming a defining moment in military protocol and tradition. Field Marshal Williams approached the cathedral entrance with the measured pace of a man who had spent decades commanding respect through presence alone. His uniform was impeccable, each medal and ribbon positioned with precision that spoke to his attention to detail and respect for military tradition. At 62 years old, Williams had become something of a living legend, having risen through the ranks based on merit rather than political connections. As he neared the steps where Captain Mitchell stood, the Field Marshal's keen eyes immediately registered something unusual about the scene. Here was a Royal Guard officer in full dress uniform, clearly prepared for a formal ceremony, yet standing outside rather than participating in the funeral of one of the military's most respected generals. Williams had not achieved his position by ignoring details that others might overlook. Colonel Henderson, who had been stationed at the entrance, quickly moved to intercept the Field Marshal before he could interact with Mitchell. "Field Marshal Williams, sir, everything is prepared for your arrival. The ceremony is proceeding according to schedule." Williams acknowledged the colonel with a brief nod, but his attention remained fixed on the Royal Guard captain. "Colonel, perhaps you could explain why this officer is not inside attending the funeral." The question was delivered in Williams's characteristically calm tone, but those who knew him understood that his quiet manner often preceded his most decisive actions. Henderson felt a bead of sweat form on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. "Sir, the officer in question is not on the authorized guest list for today's ceremony. We're maintaining strict security protocols as requested by Army Command," Henderson replied, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. Williams turned his full attention to Mitchell, who immediately snapped to attention and delivered a crisp salute. "State your name and unit, Captain." "Captain James Mitchell, 2nd Battalion Royal Guard, sir. I was ordered to attend this ceremony as the official representative of my unit to honor General Blake." The Field Marshal's expression remained neutral, but his eyes showed a flicker of interest. He had served alongside Royal Guard units on several occasions, and had always found them to be professional and competent. More importantly, Williams was well aware of the growing tensions between different branches of the military and had been watching the situation with increasing concern. "Colonel Henderson," Williams said, his voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, "are you telling me that the Royal Guard was not invited to participate in General Blake's funeral?" Henderson shifted uncomfortably under the Field Marshal's penetrating stare. "Sir, the guest list was prepared according to standard protocols. Only essential personnel and specifically approved representatives were included." "Essential personnel," Williams repeated slowly as if testing the words. "And you determined that the Royal Guard, which has participated in every major military funeral for the past century, was not essential to this ceremony?" The colonel's confidence began to crumble as he realized he was walking into dangerous territory. "Sir, the decision was made at the command level to streamline the guest list and maintain appropriate security measures." Williams nodded thoughtfully, then turned back to Mitchell. "Captain, do you have your authorization orders with you?" Mitchell immediately produced a sealed envelope bearing the official palace seal. Williams examined the document carefully, his experienced eyes noting every detail of the formal language and official signatures that authorized the Royal Guard's participation in the ceremony. "These orders appear to be in perfect order, Captain," Williams announced, his voice carrying clearly to the growing number of officers who had gathered to witness the exchange. "They bear the proper seals and signatures, and they specifically designate you as the Royal Guard's official representative for this funeral." Henderson's face had gone pale as he realized the implications of what was happening. By denying entry to an officer with valid orders, he had exceeded his authority and potentially violated several military protocols regarding inter-service cooperation. Williams folded the authorization letter carefully and handed it back to Mitchell. "Captain, in your opinion, would General Blake have wanted the Royal Guard to be represented at his funeral?" Mitchell's response was immediate and heartfelt. "Yes, sir. General Blake served alongside Royal Guard units during the border campaign and always spoke highly of our service. He once told me personally that he considered the Royal Guard to be among the finest soldiers he had ever commanded." This revelation struck Williams powerfully because it aligned with his own memories of General Blake. The deceased general had indeed been a strong supporter of military unity and had never shown the partisan attitudes that seemed to be spreading among some current commanders. "Colonel Henderson," Williams said, his tone now carrying unmistakable authority, "it appears that there has been a significant error in the preparation of today's guest list, an error that has resulted in the exclusion of a unit that should obviously be represented at this ceremony." Henderson stammered as he tried to formulate a response that might salvage his position. "Sir, I was following direct orders from my superiors regarding the guest list restrictions." "And who specifically gave you these orders, Colonel?" Williams inquired, his question delivered with the precision of a skilled prosecutor. The colonel hesitated, realizing that naming his superiors would likely result in an investigation that could have far-reaching consequences for several careers. "Sir, the orders came through regular command channels. I assumed they reflected appropriate security and protocol considerations." Williams studied Henderson for a long moment, his silence more intimidating than any verbal rebuke could have been. Around them, The assembled officers watched the exchange with fascination and growing tension, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be discussed in military circles for years to come. "Colonel," Williams finally said, "in my experience, when we start excluding honorable soldiers from ceremonies designed to honor our fallen comrades, we begin to lose sight of what truly matters in military service. General Blake gave his life in service to this country, and his funeral should reflect the unity and mutual respect that he embodied throughout his career." The Field Marshal's words carried the weight of absolute authority, and Henderson knew that any further resistance would be futile and potentially career-ending. The colonel had gambled on the assumption that his superiors would support his decision to exclude the Royal Guard, but he had not anticipated the personal intervention of the highest-ranking officer in the land forces. Mitchell remained at attention throughout the exchange, but internally he felt a surge of relief and gratitude. The Field Marshal's intervention had not only resolved his immediate predicament, but had also sent a clear message about the importance of maintaining military traditions and inter-service cooperation. Williams turned once again to Mitchell, his expression softening slightly. "Captain, I believe it's time for you to take your rightful place at this ceremony. General Blake would have expected nothing less." What happened next would be remembered as one of the most dramatic moments in recent military history. Field Marshal Williams, rather than simply ordering Captain Mitchell's admission to the ceremony, made a decision that shocked everyone present. He turned toward the cathedral entrance and, in a voice that carried across the entire courtyard, made an announcement that would resonate throughout the armed forces. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am temporarily halting this ceremony." The words sent ripples of confusion and concern through the crowd of officers. Inside the cathedral, the organ music stopped abruptly as word of the Field Marshal's announcement reached the officiating chaplain. Hundreds of uniformed personnel, many of them high-ranking commanders and foreign dignitaries, found themselves in the unprecedented situation of having a military funeral interrupted by the highest authority in the land forces. Williams stepped to a position where he could address both the officers outside and those beginning to emerge from the cathedral to see what was happening. His voice, though not raised, carried with perfect clarity across the assembled crowd. General Harrison Blake was a soldier who believed in the fundamental principle that military service transcends individual units, branches, and personal ambitions. He understood that our strength comes not from our divisions but from our unity in service to our nation and to each other. The Field Marshal paused, allowing his words to sink in while more officers filed out of the cathedral to hear what he had to say. Among them were several foreign military attachés, senior government officials, and members of General Blake's family, all looking puzzled by the unusual interruption. "Today I have discovered that certain administrative decisions have been made that would exclude worthy representatives of our military family from participating in this solemn ceremony, specifically the Royal Guard, which has served alongside General Blake and has earned the right through blood and sacrifice to be represented here today." Colonel Henderson stood frozen, realizing that his decision had now become the focal point of a very public military drama. Other officers who had supported the exclusion of the Royal Guard began to look uncomfortable as they sensed the tide of opinion turning against them. Williams gestured toward Captain Mitchell, who maintained his rigid posture despite being the center of attention for hundreds of military personnel. "This officer represents a unit that has served our country with distinction for over 2 centuries. The Royal Guard has fought in every major conflict, has protected our most vital institutions, and has earned the respect of soldiers around the world." The Field Marshal's defense of the Royal Guard was particularly significant because it came from an officer who had no personal connection to the unit and whose own career had been built entirely within the regular army structure. His words carried the weight of objective military judgment rather than institutional loyalty. General Blake specifically requested that the Royal Guard be represented at his funeral because he understood what some of us seem to have forgotten, that military honor is not diminished by recognizing the contributions of all who serve, regardless of which banner they serve under. As Williams spoke, Captain Mitchell felt a profound sense of vindication, not just for himself but for his entire unit. The Royal Guard had faced increasing criticism and isolation in recent months, with some military leaders questioning their relevance and their special status. The Field Marshal's public defense represented a powerful endorsement of their continued importance to the nation's military structure. The crowd of officers listened in complete silence as Williams continued his impromptu address. Many of them had never heard the Supreme Commander speak so passionately about issues of military unity and tradition. His reputation for cool professionalism made his emotional investment in this situation all the more striking. I am ordering that this ceremony be restructured to include all appropriate military representatives, as General Blake would have wanted. Captain Mitchell will take his rightful place among the Honor Guard, and the Royal Guard will be recognized for their service alongside General Blake during the border campaign. The Field Marshal then turned to address Colonel Henderson directly, his tone becoming more formal and ominous. "Colonel, you and I will have a private discussion after this ceremony concludes. I want to understand exactly how these exclusionary decisions were made and by whose authority they were implemented." Henderson's face had gone completely white as he realized that his career was likely over. By making the Royal Guard exclusion a public issue, Williams had essentially forced an investigation that would examine the broader question of inter-service politics and potentially expose a network of officers who had been working to marginalize certain military units. The crowd began to stir as officers processed the implications of what they had just witnessed. Many of them had been uncomfortable with the growing divisions within the military, but had not known how to address the issue. The Field Marshal's decisive intervention provided a clear statement about where the highest levels of command stood on questions of military unity. Captain Mitchell finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Field Marshal, Williams, sir. I request permission to address the assembly." Williams nodded, curious to hear what the young Royal Guard officer had to say in this extraordinary situation. Mitchell stepped forward, his bearing reflecting the years of training and discipline that had shaped him into one of the military's elite officers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to express my gratitude for the Field Marshal's intervention, but more importantly, I want to emphasize that the Royal Guard has never sought special treatment or recognition above other units." His words surprised many of the listeners who had expected him to use the moment to defend his unit's privileges or criticize those who had excluded him. General Blake understood something that I hope we can all remember today: that military service is about sacrifice, honor, and commitment to something greater than ourselves. Whether we wear the uniform of the Royal Guard, the regular Army, the Navy, or the Air Force, we are all part of the same military family. Mitchell's gracious response to his vindication impressed even those officers who had been skeptical of the Royal Guard's role in the modern military. His focus on unity rather than division demonstrated the kind of leadership and character that had made him suitable for selection to the elite unit. Field Marshal Williams smiled approvingly at Mitchell's remarks. "Well spoken, Captain. Now shall we return to the business of honoring General Blake with the dignity and respect he deserves?" As the crowd began to file back into the cathedral, the atmosphere had changed completely from what it had been an hour earlier. The ceremony that resumed would be different from what had been planned, but it would be more true to the spirit of the man they had gathered to honor. The resumption of General Blake's funeral ceremony carried a weight and significance that far exceeded its original planning. As the hundreds of military personnel filed back into the cathedral, there was a palpable sense that they had just witnessed something historic. Field Marshal Williams had not merely resolved a bureaucratic dispute, he had made a statement about the fundamental values that should guide military leadership in challenging times. Captain Mitchell walked through the cathedral doors with his head held high, but his feelings were complex. While he felt vindicated, he also understood that this incident would likely have lasting repercussions throughout the military hierarchy. The Royal Guard's relationship with other military units had been strained for months, and today's events might heal some wounds while potentially opening others. As he took his position among the Honor Guard, Mitchell found himself standing next to Major General Thompson, one of the Army's most respected field commanders. Thompson leaned slightly toward him and whispered, "Captain, what happened out there needed to happen. Too many of us have been letting politics interfere with military tradition." The comment reflected a sentiment that many officers shared, but had been reluctant to express openly. The military had always been subject to internal politics and competing interests, But recent years had seen these tensions escalate to levels that threatened the unity of purpose that was essential to effective military operations. The ceremony continued with the reading of General Blake's military history, a recitation that took nearly 20 minutes due to his extensive service record. As the chaplain detailed Blake's campaigns, his decorations, and his contributions to military strategy, Mitchell reflected on what the general had represented to soldiers across all branches of service. Blake had been unusual among senior commanders because he had actively worked to bridge the gaps between different military units. During the border campaign, he had insisted on integrating Royal Guard companies with regular Army battalions, creating mixed units that combined the Royal Guard's specialized training with the Army's tactical expertise. The experiment had been highly successful, resulting in several decisive victories that might not have been possible with conventional force structures. More importantly, Blake had mentored officers from all branches of service, never showing favoritism based on their unit affiliation. Mitchell himself had benefited from Blake's guidance during a particularly challenging deployment, when the general had taken time to personally advise a young Royal Guard lieutenant on leadership principles that transcended military boundaries. As the ceremony progressed, Mitchell noticed that other officers were watching him with new interest. His exclusion and subsequent vindication had inadvertently made him a symbol of the broader tensions within the military. Some officers approached him during quiet moments to express support, while others maintained a careful distance, unsure of how the political winds might shift in the coming weeks. Foreign military attachés who had attended the funeral were particularly intrigued by what they had witnessed. The public intervention by Field Marshal Williams demonstrated a level of military leadership that was rare in any armed forces. Most military hierarchies would have handled such disputes behind closed doors, but Williams had chosen to address the issue openly, sending a clear message about his priorities and values. During the eulogy portion of the service, General Blake's longtime aide, Colonel Sarah Martinez, spoke about her commander's philosophy regarding military unity. General Blake often said that the moment we start seeing ourselves as separate armies wearing different uniforms is the moment we begin to fail in our primary mission of defending our nation, she recalled, her voice echoing through the cathedral's vaulted ceiling. These words seemed to resonate particularly strongly with the assembled officers, many of whom had been struggling with the increasing fragmentation they witnessed within their own ranks. The general's perspective offered a path forward that emphasized shared purpose over institutional rivalry. As the ceremony neared its conclusion, Field Marshal Williams was invited to deliver the final military tribute. His words would be closely analyzed by military scholars and would likely influence policy discussions for years to come. General Blake represented the best of what military service can achieve when it rises above narrow interests and focuses on higher purposes. Williams began, his voice carrying throughout the cathedral. He understood that true military strength comes not from rigid hierarchies or exclusive traditions, but from the ability to adapt, integrate, and unite diverse capabilities in service of common goals. The field marshal paused, his eyes sweeping across the assembled officers before continuing. Today's events have reminded us that we must be vigilant against the forces that seek to divide us. Whether those forces come from outside our military family or from within our own ranks, we must resist them with the same determination we show in facing any other threat to our nation's security. Williams' words were clearly directed at more than just the immediate situation with Captain Mitchell. They addressed the broader challenges facing military leadership in an era of increasing complexity and competing priorities. His message was that military effectiveness depended on maintaining unity of purpose, while respecting the diverse traditions and capabilities that different units brought to the common mission. The ceremony concluded with the traditional military honors, the folding of the flag, the presentation to General Blake's widow, and the three-volley salute that echoed across the cathedral grounds. As the final notes of taps faded into the morning air, the assembled officers began the slow process of departure, but many lingered to discuss what they had witnessed. Captain Mitchell found himself surrounded by officers from various branches, who wanted to shake his hand and express their thoughts about the day's events. The conversations were revealing, showing that many military personnel had been concerned about growing divisions, but had not known how to address them effectively. Colonel Henderson, meanwhile, was conspicuously absent from these discussions. He had departed immediately after the ceremony concluded, undoubtedly to prepare for what would likely be a career-defining meeting with Field Marshal Williams. His attempt to use administrative procedures to make a political statement about the Royal Guard's status had backfired spectacularly, potentially ending his military career while simultaneously strengthening the very institution he had sought to marginalize. As the crowd dispersed, Mitchell realized that his role in today's events had transformed him from a simple ceremony participant into a symbol of larger principles about military service and unity. The responsibility that came with this recognition would shape his career and influence his future decisions as a Royal Guard officer. In the weeks following General Blake's funeral, the reverberations of that dramatic morning continued to spread throughout the military establishment. Captain Mitchell found himself at the center of discussions that reached the highest levels of government, including briefings with senior palace officials and parliamentary defense committees. What had begun as a simple protocol dispute had evolved into a comprehensive examination of military unity and inter-service cooperation. Field Marshal Williams proved true to his word regarding Colonel Henderson. The investigation that followed revealed a troubling pattern of decisions designed to gradually exclude the Royal Guard from significant military events. Henderson had been part of an informal network of officers who believed that the Royal Guard's special status was outdated and potentially harmful to military efficiency. Their plan had been to slowly marginalize the Royal Guard through bureaucratic means, hoping to force a reorganization that would integrate them into the regular army structure. The investigation's findings shocked many senior officials who had been unaware of these coordinated efforts. Henderson was court-martialed and dismissed from service, while several other officers received formal reprimands that effectively ended their prospects for promotion. The scandal demonstrated how institutional rivalries left unchecked could undermine military effectiveness and threaten the traditions that provided stability and continuity to the armed forces. Captain Mitchell's role in exposing these issues led to his promotion to major and his assignment to a special task force charged with improving inter-service cooperation. The irony was not lost on him that his exclusion from one ceremony had resulted in his inclusion in some of the most important military planning discussions of his generation. The task force's work revealed that the tensions between the Royal Guard and other military units were symptoms of broader challenges facing modern armed forces. Rapid technological changes, evolving security threats, and budget pressures had created an environment where different military branches increasingly competed for resources and recognition rather than working together toward common objectives. Major Mitchell used his new position to advocate for policies that would maintain the Royal Guard's unique traditions, while ensuring better integration with other military units. He proposed joint training exercises that would allow Royal Guard personnel to work more closely with regular Army units, sharing expertise and building relationships that would strengthen overall military capability. The success of these initiatives surprised even their supporters. Joint exercises between Royal Guard and Army units produced innovative tactical approaches that neither group could have developed independently. The Royal Guard's emphasis on precision and discipline complemented the Army's focus on adaptability and resource efficiency, creating combinations that proved highly effective in both training scenarios and actual operations. Field Marshal Williams became one of the most vocal supporters of these integration efforts. His intervention at General Blake's funeral had not been an impulsive decision but rather the culmination of months of observation regarding the growing divisions within the military. He had recognized that the Royal Guard controversy was an opportunity to address broader issues that threatened military effectiveness. Williams later wrote in his memoirs that the funeral incident had taught him an important lesson about leadership timing. Sometimes a leader must choose between maintaining smooth relationships and defending fundamental principles, he reflected. That morning at St. Michael's Cathedral, I realized that allowing the exclusion of worthy soldiers to continue unchallenged would have sent a message that political expedience mattered more than military tradition and mutual respect. The changes implemented as a result of the funeral controversy extended far beyond the Royal Guard status. New protocols were established to ensure that all military units would be appropriately represented at significant ceremonies, with oversight. Mechanisms to prevent administrative decisions from being used for political purposes. A joint council was created with representatives from all military branches to review policies and resolve disputes before they could escalate into public controversies. General Blake's widow, Mrs. Eleanor Blake, became an unexpected advocate for these reforms. She had been deeply disturbed to learn that her husband's funeral had nearly excluded units that he had specifically wanted to honor. Mrs. Blake used her influence as the widow of a military hero to support initiatives that promoted unity among the armed forces, often speaking at military academies about the importance of cooperation over competition. The international military community also took notice of the events surrounding General Blake's funeral. Military attachés from allied nations reported back to their own governments about the principled leadership demonstrated by Field Marshal Williams and the successful resolution of potentially divisive institutional conflicts. Several foreign military leaders invited Williams to speak at their own staff colleges about managing inter-service relationships. Major Mitchell found that his experience had fundamentally changed his perspective on military service. The humiliation of being denied entry to the funeral had been painful, but the subsequent events had taught him valuable lessons about standing firm in defense of principles while remaining open to dialogue and compromise. He began incorporating these lessons into his training of younger Royal Guard officers, emphasizing that true military leadership required both courage and wisdom. The task force led by Mitchell produced a comprehensive report that became required reading at military academies across the nation. The report outlined best practices for maintaining unit traditions while fostering cooperation, and it provided specific recommendations for preventing the kind of bureaucratic manipulation that had nearly derailed General Blake's funeral. 1. Of the most significant long-term consequences of the incident was the establishment of an annual ceremony honoring military unity. The event, held each year on the anniversary of General Blake's death, brings together representatives from all military branches to reaffirm their commitment to common purpose and mutual respect. Captain Mitchell, now promoted to lieutenant colonel, serves as the permanent coordinator for this ceremony. The ceremony has become one of the most important events in the military calendar, attracting attendance from senior government officials, foreign dignitaries, and military personnel from across the spectrum of service. It serves as both a memorial to General Blake and a reminder of the principles that he embodied throughout his career. Field Marshal Williams, now retired, often speaks at military events about the lessons learned from that dramatic morning at St. Michael's Cathedral. He emphasizes that military leadership requires not just tactical and strategic expertise, but also the moral courage to defend fundamental values when they come under attack. His decision to halt a funeral ceremony has become a case study in military leadership programs around the world. The Royal Guard itself emerged from the controversy stronger and more respected than before. The public support they received from the highest levels of military command validated their continued importance to national security, while the integration initiatives launched in response to the incident improved their relationships with other military units. Recruitment to the Royal Guard increased significantly in the years following the funeral, with many applicants citing the unit's principled stand as a motivating factor. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell often reflects on how a single morning changed not just his own career, but the entire trajectory of military relations in his country. The incident demonstrated that individual actions, even those taken in difficult circumstances, can have far-reaching consequences when they align with important principles and values. The legacy of General Blake's funeral extends beyond military circles to broader discussions about institutional integrity and principled leadership. The events of that day have been studied by organizational psychologists, public administration experts, and leadership scholars as an example of how individual courage and institutional support can combine to produce positive change, even in the face of systematic opposition. Today, the Royal Guard continues to serve with distinction, maintaining their traditional roles while participating fully in the broader military community. The special bond forged between Major Mitchell and Field Marshal Williams during the funeral crisis continues to influence military policy discussions, ensuring that the lessons learned from that dramatic morning will continue to guide future generations of military leaders. The story serves as a reminder that true military strength comes not from rigid hierarchies or exclusive privileges, but from the willingness of individuals to stand up for what is right, and from institutions that support such principled stands even when they create temporary disruption or controversy. General Blake would have been proud to know that his funeral, despite the initial controversy, ultimately strengthened the very military unity that he had championed throughout his distinguished career.